Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. I couldn't resist reading one of the latest books about Theodore Roosevelt. And if you don't know already, the mustachioed Rough Rider has sucked up quite a bit of my professional interest in the Gilded Age. I have lots of interest in the period, but I've written probably most about him. A couple of books, a couple of articles, and I'm in the process of writing another book about his presidency. I've often thought about books that could be written on Roosevelt, despite there being already hundreds, if not thousands of them already out there. I'll give you an example. It's been 70 years since Howard Beale's comprehensive account of TR's foreign policies, and so I think we're probably due for a reappraisal there. And I've also had conversations with friends where we voiced our disappointment that books about TR and race relations are not out there. Thomas Dyer's 1980 book, TR and the Idea of Race, is an exceptional book, but it's more about the theories of race and the idea of race and not the policies that Roosevelt pursued. And there are several other books that I can imagine, books about Roosevelt's friends and enemies that would make for an interesting biographical study. And there's some out there already. For example, there's books about Roosevelt and Twain, Roosevelt and the King of England, Roosevelt and Wilson, or Roosevelt and the naval thinker Alfred Mahan. But among Roosevelt's closest friends and his political allies is Henry Cabot Lodge, a fellow author, historian, and aristocratic politician with a progressive small p tendency. The two are such an interesting character study because their lives span the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And spoiler alert, they fall into their friendship in the 1880s, they fall out of their friendship in 1912, and then back into their friendship. And I guess if we're talking about their friendship, this is a political one as well as a personal one. It's one where their families are intertwined as well as their party and their policies. Their friendship, as my guest today says, changed American history. Dr. Laurence Jurdem has written The Rough Rider and the Professor, a biography of these two men and their influence in American politics. Laurence is a professor at Fordham University and at Fairfield University. He's the author of Paving the Way for Reagan, The Influence of Conservative Media on U.S. Foreign Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the show. Welcome, Laurence.
Great to be here, Michael. Thank you so very much for having me on.
I'm delighted to have you. Look, I'm going to get straight to it. I'm not going to mess around. Let's start off with the reason we're here. One of Henry Cabot Lodge's greatest accomplishments was getting Theodore Roosevelt into the White House. And I think most of the listeners to this show will know certainly who Roosevelt is, but I think they'll certainly know who Henry Cabot Lodge is. Am I right in saying no Henry Cabot Lodge, no President Roosevelt?
I wouldn't put it that bluntly. I think that Roosevelt is, as you well know from the scholarship you've done, was an extraordinarily unique figure, both intellectually, you could say physically, just in terms of being a unique person. He had tremendous drive and ambition, contrary to what one might have expected, considering the class that he had come from. One could say that he could very easily have been a complacent, somewhat soft character, and he was neither the case. I think Lodge accelerated that process. Roosevelt, I believe, would have been president at some point because he was so gifted, but Lodge certainly, as I said and say in the book, lit the rocket or guided the rocket to the White House much quicker than he otherwise would have been.
Okay, well, I mean, it does seem like in some ways when we read history, we think about the end sometimes more than the beginning, but I just wanted to get that out of the way. Let's start now at the beginning. When do Lodge and Roosevelt first meet?
They meet sporadically during TR's time at Harvard. Lodge is teaching a class on colonial American history. They're both members of the Porcellian Club. And I think they may have sporadically met at the Porcellian Club, a place that both Lodge and Roosevelt enjoyed spending time. Roosevelt's first wife, Alice Lee, was a distant cousin of Lodge's, and they may have met at a reception in Boston during the engagement process, but they really come to sort of become friendly within the convention and the turbulence of the election of 1884. Both of them are liberal Republicans, one could say somewhat idealistic. I think Roosevelt perhaps more idealistic than Lodge. They both came together as an attempt to topple the presidential hopes of James G. Blaine, who I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, the very flamboyant, charismatic, gifted politician from Maine who had been a senator, who had been the Speaker of the House, caught up in the Mobiliare scandal. And Roosevelt and Lodge really found Blaine to be an untrustworthy, kind of opportunistic figure who neither believed should be the standard bearer of the Republican Party, and they sought to topple him from that precipice, which they were unsuccessful in doing. And in that sort of disaster coming out of the convention in Chicago, this incredible friendship was born, which had extraordinary results for TR as we move through his life and career.
I think that 1884 election is so important. I think you rightly put that as the pivot point in the beginning of their relationship. It brings them together. It nearly tears the party apart. It really sets them apart from the more conservative elements in the Republican Party too. It also sets them out as being, I wouldn't say civil rights radicals, but there's one part of 1884 that does set them apart from conservative Republicans, and that's the election of Congressman John Lynch to the National Convention chair. How does that bring them together? And I want to talk a little bit about race here. TR and Lodge, they do have different ideas about race, which have implications for later on immigration policy. Can you talk us through the Lynch chairmanship in 1884, and then a little bit through on race throughout their lives?
Sure. The Lynch nomination or making Lynch the chairman of that convention was really the high point of Lodge and TR's moment at that convention. The attempt to the success in making Lynch the chairman of the convention was really an attempt to kind of try to weaken the Blaine forces. There was the chairman who had previously been considered or was going to be chairman, was a supporter, had switched from one side to the next. He had been the former governor, was governor of Arkansas, a very disreputable individual who I believe claimed he had lost an arm in the Civil War, which was not true. He shifted from one candidate to the next and promised delegates to this candidate, to that candidate. And of course, Lodge couldn't stand this man and was determined to defeat him. And at one point he says to his friends in the delegation, well, if you're not going to help me, I'm going to do it by myself. And Roosevelt's like, no, I'll help you. And so they stand together and they get Congressman Lynch, who initially is unwilling to become chairman of the convention, but Lodge and Roosevelt convince him to do that, say they need him for the future of the Republican Party. Lynch agrees to do this, and in an incredible moment in the Chicago auditorium, an incredibly tumultuous moment, Lynch is made the chairman. Roosevelt and Lodge make these incredible speeches. Neither one of them are great orators, particularly Lodge, who, as one journalist said, had a voice that sounded like the tearing of a bedsheet, or as Lodge himself said, it reminded one of a dentist's drill. And I actually think if you listen to Lodge online, which you can do, it really does sound like a drill, kind of sounding like that. And Lynch is successfully made head of the convention. Following up your point on race, this was not done out of the kindness or, let's just say, liberal views on race by either Lodge nor Roosevelt. Both men sadly, and to their detriment, had a low opinion of African Americans. They believed that they should have the right to vote, but they didn't actually believe they understood the concepts involved in electing representatives and officials. Roosevelt and Lodge had two different views on race. Lodge was very, very firm and ideologically rigid on race. He believed, quote, race is one's destiny. Once you're, whichever nation you come from, whatever cultures you inherit from that race, no, there is no change. That is immutable. No way to move away from that. Roosevelt, a bit more pragmatic in regards to that, believed that environment was the key. One can learn, one can grow through education, personal and individual experience, and one can become more enlightened and more educated and therefore more evolved over time. Lodge completely counter of that. And of course, because so much of race was ingrained within Lodge. He was so devoted to his family history, so much devoted to a certain way of viewing things. He very much believed that he had, primarily because of his race and ancestry, had a natural destiny of controlling and or leading his state and his nation. So that's a big part of Lodge's MO, so to speak.
I think that's a great way of putting it too. I mean, Lodge will eventually become one of the nation's leading eugenicists, and Roosevelt never would have adopted such a stance, certainly not in relation to genetics, at least anyway. Okay, so that's a great introduction to their meeting. One of the other things that dominates their early lives and the similarities that they have is that they're both historians. Lodge writes about Washington and Hamilton. Roosevelt actually gets his contract for Thomas Hart Benton, the biography of Benton, through Lodge. But of course, he wrote other biographies before Lodge's intervention and other books as well. Tell us about their intellectual commonalities and perhaps what differences they might have had as historians as well as commonalities.
Well, Lodge really was a historian, thus my title, The Rough Rider and the Professor. Lodge really was a professor. He received one of the very early PhDs from Harvard. He taught history at Harvard, though was not the most, let's just say, compelling professor in the world. As his first class, I believe he had something like 15 to 16 students, which plummeted to about 6 in probably a mere couple of days. He loved history. He was surrounded by it. There were many prominent historians in Boston who lived nearby, who visited the Lodge home, who had dinner with Lodge's father, John Lodge, and visited the family. Lodge was very much influenced to become a historian by Henry Adams, somebody who plays a very prominent part in this book. And again, a character I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with. Roosevelt was, let's just say, an amateur historian. He loved writing about great figures, great men, great events. His first work on the War of 1812, on the naval campaigns of the War of 1812, was really something that would have caught Lodge's interest very quickly. It was probably one of the things they initially talked about, perhaps when they met for the first time. Lodge was a great fan of nautical history and nautical affairs, having grown up with a father who had a import-export business, and Lodge would frequently go to the port of Boston just as a young boy and watch these incredible clipper ships sail off into the horizon, bound for Africa, Asia, other incredibly mysterious ports of call, and Lodge was caught up in that. Both men shared the belief that, to pull a phrase from TR's cousin FDR, that the United States had a rendezvous with destiny, that it was destined to follow George Washington's lead in his farewell address, that the United States had a destiny for a grand expansion The West, by the time Lodge and Roosevelt reach manhood, has already been colonized. It's already been occupied. The West has been closed, so to speak. And so where can one now go? Where can the United States now go? Well, abroad. That's the next destination for the United States. And Lodge and Roosevelt also come together with that belief that the United States needs to have a great Navy. They need to have a foot in the Pacific theater in order to achieve greater economic power, not to mention potentially defensive power. There was always that belief that the United States would be a sitting duck eventually for other European nations who had far more arms, a far more powerful Navy. And the United States needed to catch up to that. And Roosevelt and Lodge were determined to see that plan and idea come to fruition.
It's interesting, I think, that you refer to Roosevelt as an amateur, because I actually think that in recent years, his histories have fared a little bit better. I'm thinking here about Alexander Hamilton. Lodge writes a biography of Hamilton. And since we've had recently the Hamilton, the theater production, the musical, Hamilton's or Lodge's Hamilton seems very out of step with modern audiences. But I couldn't help thinking about Hamilton throughout the reading of this book, because I think both men, Lodge and Roosevelt, they are Hamiltonians. And I mentioned, obviously, Lodge's biography. Roosevelt certainly admitted his affection for Hamilton. They dislike Jefferson. They support federalism. Is this one of their chief, commonalities?
Yes, I think so. I think the other thing as we think about it, the Civil War is the other great commonality between the two men. Both, of course, were too young to experience life on the field of battle. Neither father of TR nor of Lodge was able to participate. Both men, however, did the best they could to support the war effort. But as you know, probably better than most, Roosevelt never seemed to forgive his father for missing one of the great moments in history, and spent his life showing perhaps the spirit of his father that, yes, I can be successful on the field of battle. Serving in war there is no greater contribution to one's nation that one can make, or indeed a way of proving one's manhood more than serving on the field of battle. Lodge really hated the old Confederate states. We see that, I believe, much later on when there's this conflict between the two over the idea of putting Judge Lurton on the Supreme Court. And Horace Lurton was a Confederate soldier. He hailed from the southern part of the country, and I really believe that Lodge had an intense dislike for any of those Southerners, be it political or military or judicial. Of course, they were all Democrats, right, at the end of the day. And Lodge had a great hostility towards the Democratic Party and those who had been a part of the secessionist cause.
I think that is such a great point about the Civil War. It was actually my next question, was about how big the Civil War looms in the memory of Roosevelt and Lodge. I just want to give a shout out to Benjamin Wetzel, who's a friend of the show, has also written a biography of Roosevelt. He's recently written an article in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era about Roosevelt and the Civil War, in which he says that Roosevelt would have sort of seen the Civil War as not just writing the policies for his administration, but also his ideas for new nationalism, and later on his ideas around World War I. So I think it's one of these critically important moments in the legacy of the Civil War, is people like Lodge and Roosevelt, who are so vehemently anti-Confederate, as you put out. I mean, this is an absolute truth, I think, that your book does a great job of showing. The other thing that I think your book does really well is showing the women in the lives of Roosevelt and of Lodge. They seem as central to Lodge and Roosevelt. Nanny Lodge and Edith Roosevelt, what roles do they play in shaping the nation's history?
Well, I think, and I love dynamic characters of both genders, and I think Nanny Lodge, as I've said before, was my favorite character to write about. I absolutely thought she was fabulous. I loved the fact that she was a very kind of an intellectual woman who had gone to Wellesley, who had an audiographic as well as a photographic memory, who could quote Shakespeare and other verse if anybody even brought it up. She also was someone who was Lodge's, her husband's, greatest literary critic. Lodge really cared about what Nanny thought of his writings, and he would show her, be the first person he would show anything he wrote, be it a speech, be it an article, be it a lecture. If she didn't like it, he'd rip it up and start again. And there's one occasion where there was a speech that he was giving to a local Massachusetts group, and I think he had to write the speech 3 times before she gave it her okay. She was really somebody who I think kind of undersold herself in terms of promoting and pushing her husband's success. Corinne Roosevelt Robinson, who was TR's sister and her great friend, wrote to her and said, I don't believe Cabot, as he liked to be called, could have succeeded without you. And she said, no, he would have been successful regardless of me. And that's an interesting point. And I think you have to look at that point in the context of the age. Women like Nanny Lodge, another great Massachusetts other great Massachusetts women before her, actually viewed themselves as wife, mother, homemaker. Somebody like Mercy Otis Warren would essentially see herself in a similar way. Despite Mercy Otis Warren being a great provocateur and satirist, she viewed herself as a wife and mother first. Her husband and children came first before anything she did. And Nanny always focused on her husband and his needs before anybody else. Edith Roosevelt, another wonderful figure, really important in TR's life. Many people argue that his first great love, someone like Edmund Morris argues, Alice Roosevelt would have been a disastrous mate for Theodore Roosevelt. She wasn't a woman of ideas. She wasn't particularly literary. She wasn't interested in sort of watching him or helping him in his great ambitions to succeed. Edith Roosevelt adored TR from the time they were young children, and she knew him perhaps better than he knew himself. And one example is when he was thinking about taking the vice presidency, something Lodge was urging on him. She was like, Theodore, this is a disaster. It's a position that would lock him away. He would be contained. There would be no way to use that great intellectual energy. And she believed, and rightly so, that he would fall into a depression and make life very difficult for himself and others. And that's precisely what happened. She really, along with Lodge, helped contain that extraordinarily unpredictable temperament and energy that drove Theodore Roosevelt. And without Edith Roosevelt by his side, it would have been a lot harder for him to succeed, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And I think you do a great job of showing the rise. I mean, that's the sort of story of Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's rise has been covered, I think, extensively now. I mean, I think whether we're talking about Edmund Morris, who you mentioned, or others, I think where your book allows us to see some of the other gray areas is around policies that the two men held and some of the not only commonalities, but disagreements that they had. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and this is, I was thinking about my friend Mark Palin, an economic historian, who knows, he might be listening, he might enjoy this question, but Lodge and Roosevelt start off as free traders. And by 1896, they're Republican protectionists. How do they go through this conversion on the tariff question? How does that come about?
Well, I think they both came to realize, I think at the heart of all of this, particularly with Lodge, every thought about Lodge had was political. Every thought Lodge had was about how to preserve the superiority in terms of an electoral point of view of the Republican Party. Tariffs were during the 19th century, certainly, and I find myself thinking one of the reasons I wrote the book was how similar so many of the ideas that dominated Lodge and Roosevelt's time seem to affect our own time today. Obviously, tariffs favored the American working man. It was something that certainly the idea of, well, we'll cut out all foreign competition. We want our folks to succeed. And this was an idea that really dominated the Republican Party. We see the second election of Grover Cleveland. He deviates a little bit from this, loses his second after he wins a second time. But I really believe everything with Lodge and Roosevelt as they move up through their careers, Henry Cabot Lodge is always thinking politically. I believe he would have been a marvelous strategist if he were alive today. And TR learns that from him. Lodge tells Roosevelt early on, you've got to work within the party system. You've got to work within the party structure. Don't deviate from it, because that's a road to nowhere. And that is the thing that I think really drove the break in 1912, because Lodge had spent his decades instructing TR, telling him, do this, don't do that. And Lodge was somebody who, when you didn't listen to him, it upset him. There were other things that upset him too. But one of the things was, if you don't take his views seriously, that's not good. And I think he felt really hurt when this happened in 1912. And of course, I'm sure we'll get to that later on. But I think politics drove everything with both men, more so with Lodge than with TR.
Would you say that politics drove their foreign policy ideas? Because in some ways, I think foreign policy, which is something that they share in common, a view about America becoming a world power, is actually probably at the expense of politics. In other words, you have party leaders like McKinley who are saying, well, hang on, let's kind of restrict ourselves. And there's other Republicans that are saying, let's not take Cuba. Let's have a modicum of restraint here. But they promote an agenda from the 1890s and the Spanish-American War straight to the Great War, which really is born out of conviction and not of politics. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. 100%. Both men they had this belief in American exceptionalism. This was what they were grounded in, this belief that the United States was a great nation. Its ideas and its founding documents were unique and special, and this philosophy needed to be spread to all corners of the world to make the globe more safe, more secure. And I believe that I keep using this word destiny, and I don't think that's too much to say, but I think both men really believed that the U.S. had a great destiny to play in the world. That, I believe, is one of the things that drove Lodge's great desire to prevent the League of Nations from occurring, because he saw Woodrow Wilson as a man who was trying to undo all this work that Lodge and Roosevelt were trying to do to make the United States subservient as opposed to make it superior, as opposed to make it the leader of the world as opposed to a follower. And I think that was the thing that really drove them throughout their relationship in terms of foreign policy.
I want to come back to foreign policy. You mentioned the League of Nations. Naturally, we've got to close on that, and we have to cover a bit more ground before we jump all the way ahead to 1919. You mentioned Henry Adams, right? Let's come back to him, because one of the things that I think biographies should be doing is getting the nuances. And Henry Adams seems like a good character to do that. He has mixed feelings about both Lodge and Roosevelt. So can you tell us a little bit about how his views on these two men change over time?
Yeah, Henry Adams, who I really loved writing about, and I'm sure his letters have come up on your podcast occasionally, and his works, but really to get a sort of a fly on the wall of what the Gilded Age was like, I encourage everyone to read even a few of his letters, because Adams is one of the great correspondents, I think, of all time. he initially, Henry Adams took Henry Cabot Lodge under his wing. He had been Lodge's professor at Harvard. Lodge had reached out to Adams on his honeymoon, asking him where he should go in terms of profession. What should he do? Lodge had lost his father at a very early age. There was no paternal influence there. Henry Adams, in a way, became a paternal influence to Lodge, and he encouraged Lodge to become a historian. He introduced him to the Republican Party, Republican politics, various reformers within the Republican Party, and thought that Lodge would be a very good politician, but was wary that Lodge would get sucked into the maelstrom of ego and pragmatism and do things that were completely opposite of what Adams believed someone who represented the nation in Congress or the Senate should do. And so when Lodge started to become more pragmatic, more, let's say, Machiavellian, Henry Adams lost an enormous amount of respect for Lodge. He adored Nanny. He adored the children. They, despite his dislike of Cabot, they took frequent trips together to Europe. And Lodge really did love Henry Adams. He tolerated the fact that Adams disliked him, but I think he really had a lot of loyalty towards Henry Adams. Roosevelt, I think, appreciated Adams. Adams, I think, kind of always went up and down with TR. There was a lot of jealousy there. I think Adams felt his life had not been complete. He had not achieved the greatness that his grandfather, John Quincy Adams, and his ancestor, John Adams, had achieved. He wasn't a counselor to presidents. He wasn't an advisor to presidents. And I think that really made him very bitter in terms of being around TR. I think he thought TR was an extremely capable man, but I feel like he just didn't like TR's personality. He hated the fact that he was such a kind of such an egotist, and he was always talking, and he'd never shut up. And there's a great moment in my book, I think, where they're sitting in the White House and Henry Adams is having dinner, and suddenly he says, and suddenly we heard this blah, 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 the entire time. And it just drove me crazy. So Henry Adams was just a wonderful figure. But I think, as somebody said, who I was speaking to, another historian, I said, what would you think about sitting next to Henry Adams at dinner? And she said, well, I think I'd rather be across from him.
Fair enough. And I think maybe what we're getting to here too is that personalities clash, and when politics get involved, they get even messier. And that seems like a little bit the case between TR and Lodge as well. Once TR gets to the White House, there's the beginning of this clash as well, because Lodge convinces Roosevelt to appoint Oliver Wendell Holmes as the next Supreme Court justice when Justice Gray is stepping down, or I can't remember, does he die or does he retire? But anyway, Oliver Wendell Holmes replaces Gray, and it seems all rather downhill, at least during the administration from there. How does their relationship deteriorate from Holmes and then into sort of conflicts between corporate regulation and lawsuits against trusts? How does it change?
Well, I think the thing that is very interesting is that before Roosevelt becomes president, he's very dependent on Henry Cabot Lodge. The correspondence between the two of them, Roosevelt is always writing Lodge, asking for something. Do you know this person who could perhaps appoint me to this? If something opens up here, could you keep me in mind? I really need to come talk to you. I really need to spend a few minutes with you. When TR becomes president, something Lodge had wanted for him, I don't want readers to miss the idea that this is something that Henry Cabot Lodge had wanted. He believed Roosevelt could be president. He was saying this several years before McKinley was assassinated. So when When Roosevelt becomes president, Lodge is delighted. It's only later when Lodge realizes he can't necessarily, he does not have that carte blanche to the White House, as so many senators and congressmen and media folks thought. I just want to tell one little bit. There was a journalist that talked to Roosevelt soon after he became president, and he asked the new president, Mr. President Roosevelt, how are you going to deal with Senator Lodge? Because so many people believe you guys are so close. Is it going to be difficult for you to sort of distance yourself from him, and in terms of things like patronage and favors and other things? And Roosevelt looked at this journalist and said, no, you don't understand. Lodge does not run me. I run Lodge. And I think that was a really strong statement. And I think it also said that, you know what, this junior relationship that many of you believe that Cabot and I have, well, that's over. And I'm going to do exactly what I want to do. And I still hope he'll help me, but we'll have to see. When Holmes is appointed, something that Roosevelt was more than happy to do. As Henry Cabot Lodge said, nobody pressures Theodore Roosevelt. That's just not something that can happen. And Roosevelt and Holmes had a long conversation. Roosevelt thought, well, he's a fellow Harvard man. Our views seem to coalesce, and he probably will be a terrific addition to the court. When the decision on the railroad trust occurs, and Holmes does not vote with the majority, Roosevelt is completely flummoxed. He doesn't understand how this could happen. Already he's a little bit agitated about it. He naturally blames Lodge for pushing this man on him, which of course is completely untrue. But there are other tensions as well. Lodge, for all of his saying, well, I've come as far as I can, i.e. the Senate is as far as I can go, Lodge always wanted to keep his hand in the game. Initially, when Lodge had first started in Congress, and even before, he was very unhappy. He was uncomfortable with the idea of patronage. Lodge was a fan of civil service reform. That's something that he and Roosevelt both shared. But of course, Lodge was a political man, first and foremost, believed that patronage was important to re-election. And he would ask Roosevelt, what about appointing this guy? What about appointing him? And Roosevelt literally said to a friend of his, I've got to be very, very careful. I've got to hold Cabot at arm's length. I can't get this impression of impropriety if I'm leaning too hard or leaning too much towards Massachusetts. And this annoyed Lodge. I mean, he found it really irritating. And at one point, he reached out to Roosevelt to ask him to write a proclamation for the 200th anniversary of Brookline, Massachusetts. And Roosevelt gets this note, and literally a couple of days later, he writes this incredibly strong letter back to Lodge in which he says, my good man, please don't ever ask me to do something like this again. I get this from everybody. I don't need to get this from you. And Lodge, who I really don't believe expected something like that to come sailing across his desk, immediately writes back, oh, I was only kidding. Now, Lodge didn't have much of a sense of humor, and he had no sense of humor when it came to politics or patronage. So I think he realized, okay, I need to back off, or I could really damage this friendship that I have.
Yeah, I think that Holmes situation is it's a turning point. It's a turning point for Roosevelt, who's an accidental president. And he then, his next nomination is William Henry Moody, who he picks quite purposefully because he knows exactly how Moody is going to vote. He is, as you say, no longer dependent on Lodge. He is his own man and makes that point. So I guess if their relationship deteriorates a little bit, Taft's presidency offers a little bit of a revival for it, and then an eventual complete break. I was wondering if you could take us through the years 1910 to 1912, because they really are the sort of It's like this crescendo and then coda of their relationship. They come back together, they fall back apart again, right? How does it happen?
Yeah, Lodge, I think he admits later, uh, after Taft is elected, that he really would have wanted Roosevelt to have had a third term. Initially, he was glad that Roosevelt didn't have a third term. I think from a physical and mental point of view, I think he was concerned about the energy that Roosevelt had put into the presidency and the belief that it would affect his health. And I think Lodge was happy that Roosevelt left the presidency in a relatively healthy manner. However, William Howard Taft, who Lodge knew was not as close with as TR was. Both Lodge and Roosevelt were social animals. They loved going to dinner. They loved chatting. They loved gossiping and having a nice time. Taft was the opposite. Taft was a very introverted, cerebral fellow who preferred the confines of his office as opposed to being out in public. And when Taft becomes president, something his wife wanted more than Taft wanted, Lodge begins to watch the Taft administration with mounting concern. Roosevelt is off on his grand tour. He's in Africa, hunting white tigers and elephants on a safari sponsored by the Smithsonian institution. And Lodge just finds Taft to be this anathema of a figure who he literally tells Roosevelt at one point, this guy doesn't seem to know anything about politics. I'm amazed at, for all of his time in public life, he seems to be completely ignorant about who will have to be on time for meetings, to know who to speak with, he's out of town way too much. And he's just unhappy with the way the presidency is going. And Lodge is always thinking 10 steps ahead of everybody else. He's always thinking about midterm elections, about presidential elections, about perception, about the way a certain bill is going to go. And Taft is just very complacent, very laid back, doesn't seem all that worried about anything. He keeps people waiting for hours. He sees Lodge on occasion. Taft offered Lodge the opportunity to be Secretary of State. So for all of Lodge's complaining, if he had wanted to be more involved in the administration, he very easily could have been. And so Lodge begins writing Roosevelt these incredibly lengthy descriptive letters, which are very kind of depressing and almost frantic in a way. And Lodge is kind of metaphorically almost like a stalker, because everywhere Roosevelt goes in Africa and Europe, there is a letter from Lodge that meets him at every destination he arrives in. And he says, Taft's opinion ratings are going down. I'm concerned about the midterms. You need to come back. The public wants you back. There's a void that you can fill. And Roosevelt doesn't want to come back. I mean, he's happy doing what he's doing. He's resentful and angry at Congress, primarily at the Republican conservatives, for blocking so much of the legislation that he had proposed in his second term. And he has no interest in coming back. But Lodge is doing what he does so well, which is whispering in Roosevelt's ear, brushing his ego, saying, oh, the nation needs you. You need to come back. And Roosevelt comes back. But of course, what Lodge doesn't realize is that Roosevelt, who was never comfortable within the conservative confines of the Republican Party, comes back and has some new ideas. And the ideas that he has are these ideas that are coming in from the West, that are coming in from the mind of fighting Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, ideas like primaries, ideas like the recall of judges, ideas like referendums on issues, ideas with which Lodge finds completely abhorrent and foreign and contrary to the Constitution. And so when Roosevelt starts evoking these ideas, Lodge is getting more and more disturbed over that. And he's trying to kind of calm Roosevelt down. He's not being very urgent about it, saying, yes, I know you've said these things on occasion, but maybe you need to calm down on things like potentially the idea of an individual's private property being seized for the good of the country, or this idea of a justice being recalled because the public doesn't like an opinion. Think about what the legal structure of the nation could be like and the kind of caliber of justices we might have. Roosevelt's not really listening to any of this. He's listening to other people. He's listening to Gifford Pinchot, his former environmental czar, or James Garfield, the son of the late president, who's giving him some other ideas. And all of this comes to a head when we reach 1912 and Roosevelt's decision to run against Taft in let's say at the primaries. Obviously, it's not the primary system that we know today. You had a number of primaries that primarily were out in the West. You had other primaries as well, but you also had the power of political bossism still very much in vogue. And essentially, what happens is Roosevelt reaches the convention with Taft, with a bunch of delegates still needed for either man to get the nomination. The convention is stacked in Taft's favor. Lodge had helped Taft win the Massachusetts primary, something that Roosevelt may or may not have known. As it was, Edith Roosevelt really came to dislike Henry Cabot Lodge, because Henry Cabot Lodge subsequently wrote to TR that he would not support him in his challenge to Taft. He wrote him a very heartfelt letter. He said, "You have hurt me more than anybody else has." This is a letter, Michael, by the way, that is in the published correspondence of the Lodge Roosevelt letters, correspondence that, and we may or may not want to talk about this, that Lodge manipulated and edited later on in his life. And it just shows you, I think, how hurt Lodge was that he kept that letter for all to see in that correspondence. So there is this break then between the two men, who then for several months barely correspond after writing one another letters, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And Lodge believes the friendship between he and TR is more important than a primary. So he says, "I will stay out of the primary." Roosevelt doesn't care. He is enraged at Henry Cabot Lodge. He is really, really angry at him. He makes a few comments about a certain senator from Massachusetts who was responsible for stealing the convention from him during his Bull Moose campaign in 1912. Cabot, who is off campaigning for Taft, says, to a reporter, "I think people have had enough of Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, we're really tired of this constant complaining." They meet each other occasionally. Henry Adams writes, "Well, if you expected some fireworks when the two got together at my dinner table, that didn't happen." And they really only come back together after Theodore Roosevelt is shot during a speech during the 1912 campaign. Lodge writes some very heartfelt telegrams to Roosevelt, which he says, "We are very worried about you and really hope you get better soon." And Roosevelt comes to realize, I'm going to forgive this fellow. And he forgave Lodge based on the fact that Lodge then received an invitation to attend Theodore Roosevelt's daughter's Edith's wedding. Interestingly enough, longtime friends William Howard Taft, longtime friend Elihu Root were not invited. And Roosevelt even says, you know what, I understand Lodge's predicament. Root, however, no way. He really hurt me. And they eventually come back together. And then Woodrow Wilson wins the election. And this cements that relationship back to where it was after 1884, this hatred, mutual hatred that both men have for the former president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey.
I'm glad you mentioned the letters between Roosevelt and Lodge. I'm going to come back to that later on, but I also just want to highlight the point that you make that somehow Lodge escapes the worst of TR's anger after 1912. Root never really recovers, and Taft and Roosevelt make friends around 1916, 1917. And they put their bygones, sort of behind them. But that doesn't happen with Lodge. Lodge and him remain friends. And look, I could dwell on World War I. I think World War I is incredibly important, but actually, I think it's incredibly important for their relationship. Lodge supports Roosevelt when Roosevelt wants to raise a regiment of troops, and obviously they both have this hatred for Wilson. But the thing that is more interesting to me is the end of the war. After the armistice, we know that Theodore Roosevelt is, kind of on death's door at this stage, and Lodge knows that as well. But the Treaty of Versailles is something that brings them together ideologically, politically, and probably their closest since 1884, I would think. Why is it that the treaty does this, and how does their friendship shape the post-war order? Even if TR dies in 1919, how do their ideas continue to shape American foreign policy into the 20th century?
Well, I think both men, it's so interesting. If you look at the United Nations today, and perhaps this is sort of kind of the back end of your question, the United Nations today does have a military arm to it. This is something that Theodore Roosevelt very much wanted. It was something that he believed was essential to the success of the League of Nations. Without it, he believed that it was just a paper tiger, that it had no influence behind it. He was not an idealist in terms of foreign policy. He believed that, nations will naturally attempt to be hegemonic with one another. And ultimately, if the UN doesn't have any sort of military, or the League of Nations doesn't have any sort of military arm, then what good is it? Lodge believed a similar view, but he also believed this idea that the US should play second fiddle to other nations was completely foreign to him. Lodge was, to use a current phrase, an America First man. And he believed that the United States should be first and foremost at the helm of anything that is in anything that occurs within the international arena. Both men believed that the U.S. should be a great superpower. And this is exactly what we have seen today. I think it is interesting that both men had, Lodge had what we now refer to as this Wilsonian idealism, this idea that the United States should sweep from the United States should sweep the world, should be adapted by other societies. It could make the globe more secure, more sustainable, et cetera. And of course, we saw that with situations like the Iraq War and Afghanistan and other things where we attempted to adapt kind of a United States vision of what a nation should be, and this didn't work. And I think Lodge and Roosevelt both had similar ideas, this imperialist attitude that neither one ever lost, but both men believed in the greatness of the United States, that it was an exceptional nation and it needed to drive the world. And I think those ideas still very much exist today.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't even thought of that. I mean, I think there's certainly the through line. There's interesting ways America First or Safer Democracy, whether they're the same thing or not. I don't think they are, but I mean, I do think that there is a through line. Certainly, the idea around an alliance, a military alliance, was something that Theodore Roosevelt believed in. Lodge, I suppose, one of his big contentions is, as you pointed out, that he was a big constitutionalist, and his worry was that the Constitution wasn't really being serviced in the League of Nations agreement. Whether he would think that about the United Nations, I think, is an interesting question. But I want to finish on your point about the letters, because, well, I tell you what, let's put you at the heart of your own book. I mean, you are the author, so let's put yourself there. You've gone with the title Rough Rider and Professor. There is a slight tone of, well, Rough Rider maybe gives off the vibe of, well, I mean, you use these words. You call Roosevelt self-centered and reckless at times. Lodge comes off much more balanced in this. But as you point out, Lodge actually changes the historical record, changes the letters that he wrote. So, I mean, what's supposed to be our estimate of Lodge and Roosevelt at the end of your book? Is it the sort of self-centered and reckless Roosevelt and the balanced Lodge, or is there more to it that you want to share with us?
No, I think, I think both men were, we have this, there's that conversation going on today about how you judge historical figures and the context of today. And I think both men were products of their time. I mean, both men could be very impulsive, as we saw with Lodge punching that constituent in the face because he called him a coward because of his desire to follow Wilson in his support of World War I. There is very much this, we talk a lot now today about this masculinity issue, and Roosevelt very much was that. Both men were very competitive with one another. Roosevelt much more so with Lodge. There's so many examples of this, of Roosevelt out in the West writing Lodge. I've done this, I've captured this outlaw. Roosevelt writing about his experience fox hunting. Well, I always like to pay the piper occasionally before I have a good dance, crashing to the ground, breaking a couple of limbs. Lodge telling Roosevelt all the fabulous people he's hanging out with over in London in the 1890s. Roosevelt responding, well, I guess I'm really the only person who's the only working politician among us. So there was this back and forth. I think there was a genuine, I think this really on some levels was a tremendous camaraderie among these two men. They really adored one another. I think Lodge would have done anything for Theodore Roosevelt. And I suspect Theodore in some levels may have felt the same way. But of course, Roosevelt believed that, the presidency and integrity and all of this sort of thing were really important. He wasn't willing to do swap favor for favor with Lodge. But I think the two men, you really wouldn't have one, certainly in terms of the acceleration to the presidency for Theodore Roosevelt, without Henry Cabot Lodge. And I feel one of the reasons I wrote the book was that every narrative you read about TR, Lodge is there. He's there, right? But not really there. You don't get a sense that he's such an integral part of that relationship. And that was the thing that I came to realize after I wrote the book, that I hope comes out. It's not my intention to sort of rehabilitate Henry Cabot Lodge, because obviously in high school one was taught, Lodge was responsible for the death of Woodrow Wilson. I think he's a much more of a complex figure, much more emotional figure and thoughtful figure than we get a sense of. And I think he and TR really match up very, very well. And there are tons of commonalities they have with one another, not just politics, not just foreign policy, but a love of history and a love of sports and a love of competition and socializing and drama and literature and so many other things.
All right, Laurence, I'm going to have to put a finer point on it. You mentioned Henry Adams and dinner parties. Who would you rather have dinner with, Lodge or Roosevelt?
I think I'd probably have rather have dinner with Roosevelt, because I think, Lodge could be very difficult, and I just don't know how that would he might be rather unappealing to sit next to. I think Nanny would have been fun too, though.
Fascinating character. Look, it's an interesting take on two dominant figures in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Laurence, I can't thank you enough for joining us on the show and giving up your time and sharing the book.
Thank you, Michael. It was a real pleasure. And knowing that you're a Roosevelt scholar, it was wonderful to get in front of you and hear your thoughts about the book.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.